Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Karen Watts and Kislaya Prasad for this kind introduction and for the Smith School for inviting me to make this presentation here. What Kislaya did not mention is that before joining Calvert Foundation, my early work was really in the microfinance field. And what I'm here to talk about today is a little bit about women's experience in microfinance and some important lessons as we begin to change our focus and starting to look at women in small and medium enterprises. Really beginning to look at a new frontier, a new day, looking forward for women and as entrepreneurs. You know, I began my career, as I said, really, if you can imagine 30 years ago, setting up microfinance programs in Africa. And whereas today we think about microfinance as being something that's such a proven and well-known, automatic, this is something that works in this world. You know, back then there was a lot of uncertainty. And in fact, because history had shown that, you know, women and the poor were not very good credit risks. And I remember some of my first loans that were made in a program in Liberia. And if you could imagine, we started out by having the women, you know, apply for the loans, and they would, when they would get the loan, they were, of course, illiterate, so they would sign with their thumbprint, and so their thumbprint would be there in blue. And in fact, our repayment rates were still not very good, so we thought, well, let's try something new and different. And we had the women have a co-signer from their clan or village, to also just another person. And so there we would have these loan documents with a woman's thumbprint in blue and her co-signer with a thumbprint in green. And that actually had a 50% improvement in loan repayment rate. So we were all very happy and excited. But we thought 50% is still not going to get us there. So we then introduced the idea that the village chief would co-sign the loan. And lo and behold, we then had these loan documents with the blue thumbprint from the woman, the green thumbprint for her co-signer, and the red thumbprint from the village chief. And with that, we did, in fact, begin to get very good repayment rates. It's sort of a colorful and silly story, but it really emphasizes that a lot of experience about how we do things and how to make different programs available and successful for women is really going to be invented along the way, that it's not something that's always sitting there on a textbook. Because I actually feel, you know, as we look at some of the new trends related to small and medium, women in small and medium enterprises, that's an area where we have yet to begin to develop the new kinds of methods and new ways of doing this. Of course, Rupert Schofield this morning told you a lot about success stories of women who are in the microenterprise field, and we often think of women, when we think about microfinance, we think of women. And I too can recall, you know, the examples go on and on. One of my favorite was, you know, a woman who was a seamstress who first started out where she would just do small orders to repairs and fix things up. Once she got a loan, she was able to have some material and inventory. She started making clothes for sale. And then she came up with the idea of manufacturing handbags from scraps of material. And the next thing I know, I came back to visit her a couple years later, and she was exporting these to the United States. And for me, what's important about these stories is the fact that when you meet these women who are engaged with these enterprises, the sense of ownership and pride and accomplishment that they demonstrate. And to me, that's what stands out the most. And of course, women weren't always at the table in microfinance. People lose sight of the fact that in Grameen, when Grameen first started, it was only fewer than 20% of the borrowers were women. And in Acción, also known for its work with women entrepreneurs, some of their earliest programs, such as in the Dominican Republic with the tricicleros, the tricycle drivers, that in fact they were all men clients. But over time, this has shifted over, and such that the vast majority today of women clients in microfinance are women. For an institution like Grameen Bank, it's 97% women. For BRAC, it's 92% women. Even institutions like SKS of India and Compartamos of Mexico are almost exclusively women, and that's data as of 2009. And this is often because women have proven themselves to be very good borrowers. So ultimately, there's like a strong business case to be lending to women. And there's also that other compelling story compelling reason that I understand that Rupert talked about, which was a recognition that when women have surpluses, they invest in their children, they invest in their family, they send their kids to school, they improve, they put roofs on their homes, they are going to provide for the health of their children, clean water, so that there's like a compelling social benefit when you're dealing with women entrepreneurs. And once again, I'm forever struck by the fact that I think what's caught people's attention about microfinance is that people historically have thought about women as being weak and vulnerable. But when you see these women entrepreneurs, women who are running businesses, who demonstrate that business savvy, you see dynamic individuals, dynamic pioneers who are changing their own destinies and the destinies of their families. This is all fine and well, but many of us have the question, do women own and run businesses grow? All this story about microfinance and all these women-run microenterprises. And in fact, some of the early research shows it's not so very positive about these women-run businesses actually growing to become small and medium enterprises. And there's lots of reasons, and we have yet to learn a lot more why that is. But clearly, there are some significant cultural barriers. Women in many cultures will tend to diversify into many lines of businesses. It's a way of managing risks so that if one business doesn't succeed, they can shift into another. It's also about staying below the radar screen so that if they have many small businesses as opposed to one large one, it's less likely to attract the attention of their neighbors. Fewer people are going to come with a begging bowl asking them to be bailed out. It also means their husbands are going to be less likely to try and rifle the assets of the business. So there seems to be some other kinds of cultural reasons that are leading women to prefer this model of many small businesses. The other issue, of course, for women to grow their businesses has to do with certain pressures that women face. And it's funny because sometimes researchers will actually, I saw one researcher comment that women lacked self-control because they weren't able to aggregate assets as well as men in their business. Well, we as as mothers and people who run families understand that if women are often at the front line of shocks, so that if a child is sick, money is going to be taken out of the business to buy the penicillin to help the child. Or women are often the ones that are expected to make the world right for their family and in their households. And therefore, there's a lot more pressure on women in terms of how they use the disposable income from the business that actually constrains their ability to aggregate assets that may be necessary for this major growth. That being said, there are some important examples that really stand out as against the norm. There's a pretty well-known bank in Kenya called the Equity Bank that's been really kind of a front runner. It started out as a microfinance institution, and today it's a full-service bank. And I was talking with the president of that bank, Charles Mwangi, about a year ago. And we were talking about the issue of micros growing to small business. And his comment was, well, yeah, it's true, most of them don't grow, but there really are a number of important exceptions, he was telling me. And in fact, they were holding a seminar that they had brought together 10 breakaway entrepreneurs, he called them. And he talked about how each of these entrepreneurs had started with very small loans and now had substantial businesses, hotels, really not just SME, but really quite prominent businesses, particularly in the Kenyan context. And so I've had this interest about women in the SME space, so I turned to him and I said, oh, of those 10, well, how many are women? And I was expecting him to say either none or maybe 1 or 2. And he looked at me and he said, oh, 8 of the 10 are women, which absolutely floored me. And it floored me for 2 reasons. One, the fact that here we have all these significant number of important examples of breakaway women entrepreneurs. But what's most stunning is that he didn't even think to mention it, that in that context, it was so common to him that there could well be very successful women that it really caught my attention. which is really why I'm saying that really it's a new day for women entrepreneurs. After this long focus of women in the microsector, there's a good number of us who are now putting our attention on women business owners at the SME level. And there's good reason for us to be focusing on this, putting aside the vignettes of the individual women and their lives. Quite frankly, if we want to see economies grow, we're going to need to see women-owned businesses grow and succeed like their male counterpart businesses. A few people have already cited the World Economic Forum's study that basically, aligns a country's competitiveness with how narrow the gender gap may be in their business ownership. Yet at the same time, in so many countries, it's only about a third of formal SMEs are owned by women, owned and led by women. And in fact, once you get to the medium-scale enterprise, it's really only 1 in 5 that's owned by women. The other thing where we see women being very disadvantaged is that they tend to be in line in pursuing businesses that are consumer-oriented sectors, where they're operating with low value-added sectors such as garments and food processing and restaurants. So even when women own and operate, they may be at a disadvantage. All this is causing us at USAID and others to start saying, well, what's really behind this all? What can we learn about it? Who's really tackling this? Because sure as I'm standing here, we may have questions, but I know that people out there in the field are dreaming up the answers. Last year, there was a bit of a competition internally to USAID. There was some resources that could be focused broadly on the area of women in leadership. And I sort of raised my hand and said, it's time for us to look at women in the SME field, women as leaders in the SME sector. What's really behind this? What can we learn? What's driving this? And who's really doing something about it? So we really have begun a whole sort of research agenda. You know how our development agencies are. And we really kind of have designed a sort of framework in which we're really trying to begin to unpack what are these factors that inhibit women's business growth. And we anticipate there to be sort of 4 main factors that we're trying to study and analyze. One of them is referred to as an external constraint gap, and it considers that there are substantial gender-specific barriers to entrepreneurship which constrains the performance of female entrepreneurs. And that has to do with the very obvious things of obtaining credit, creating business networks because businesses need networks to grow, and then also dealing with government and government agencies. We find that there are social norms that really will restrict women's abilities to their mobility and their capacity to engage with external parties. And so that's one important area we're delving into. Next, the human capital gap. Getting back to, there was some discussion in the last questions about training and education for women. We're finding, are women getting the same access to training and resources and mentoring and coaching that men may be getting? There's another whole area around risk aversion gap. We recognize that women are more risk averse, in part because of their obligations to their families. But then the question becomes, what do we do about it? If there were to be more guarantee schemes, other kinds of backup supports, would there be a way that we could enable even the more risk-averse women to be much more successful in their businesses? And finally, one area that I'm particularly interested in has a lot to do with intra-family dynamics. What we find in so many cultures, that it's the sons who will be able to get a small advance from a family member to launch a business. But it's very difficult for that same family to provide those resources to their women, to women in their family. So while we'll be doing these studies about these gaps, at the same time, I, for one, hark back to my experience in the field of microfinance. And I know that while I might be sitting here in Washington trying to understand these constraints, there are, in fact, real people all around the globe that are out there beginning to work on these issues. So as much as we're studying the constraints, we want to learn from those who are at the forefront, testing new methods and finding new ways to get things done. A few that have just come across our horizon recently You know, I go to meetings like this, is our group MEDA. Is an organization that does a lot with enterprise development. They're based in Canada, I believe. But they have an interesting program in Pakistan, and what's very striking about that, and this is actually a USAID-funded program in Pakistan, where they're working with homebound women to get them to be doing the craft production or manufacturing food products at their homes. And what's interesting about what MEDA has done is not only the organizing the women into the cooperative associations, all the different things you've already heard about today, but those women have to sell their products to get it to the market. And rather than relying on yet another male middleman who might not be offering competitive terms of trade, may not be giving these women a fair price for their labor, they're actually training women wholesalers. So they're picking from each community a woman who's been a producer and actually training them on how to, the inventory management, how to do the inspection, how to collect and aggregate the production of other women, and to really, and supporting them to go out and to sell those products to external markets. So once again, it's like introducing women into yet that middle person kind of role. And what's important to me about that is that, you know, whereas I started in the microfinance field and I still head up USAID's microenterprise office, we really feel it's not about looking at the micro-entrepreneur in a vacuum, but understanding how they relate to markets and how by enabling a number of women wholesalers, we'll create a pull factor that will ripple over and reach many, many thousands of households. So it's really part of a dynamic economy. Another organization I heard about also in Pakistan is something called the Ladies Fund. Once again, just went to a meeting and this woman came up, was talking about what she's doing. And that, very interesting, is oriented more towards women coming a bit more from the middle class that may be working in corporate positions, and they're helping those women to leave those corporate positions to set up their own companies and providing networks of support, mentoring relationships, and even an angel fund, because once again, those women come from families that may have some capital, but they're going to be much more conservative about staking that with their daughters. So once again, I was very impressed. Another example out there, if you didn't go to the meeting, you may not have learned about them. IFC has been doing a lot of work looking at banks that are starting to be much more proactive about women in the SME space. And, you know, earlier I was talking about the Equity Bank, but IFC mentions Group Access Bank in Nigeria. Over the last 3 years, it expanded a portfolio to women-run SMEs. It's now a $33 million portfolio with an average loan size of $100,000. This is not microenterprise, and it's really showing women stepping up in a much more substantial way. You also have commercial banks like Standard Charter, that's, you know, throughout Africa. ICICI also is making a big commitment in this space. And what's nice is that it's not just USAID that's looking at this women's SME space. There's a number of institutions that are all really turning their attention and focusing on women in this next level of challenge of SMEs. Associated with the G20 is the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. They have made part of their agenda a specific focus on women and SMEs. The World Bank is also getting involved in partnership with USAID, but the World Bank will be looking at women SME in the World Bank projects. And just recently I was at some other meetings and heard that the Multilateral Investment Fund associated with the IDB is also launching a major initiative around women in SME. What for me makes this very, very exciting is it kind of brings me a little bit to the feeling I had 30 years ago when I was starting in microfinance, and it felt like we were in this very uncharted ground. You know, people said this couldn't be, it won't be possible. And some people will say that about women in the SME space, that micros will never grow, women will never be able to really compete in this arena. And I'd like to take heart a bit from the experience that we've had earlier about this year-by-year dedicated effort across a range of different organizations and institutions that will be sharing experience across different organizations, including We Connect, no? That another organization I heard about, I actually have been hearing about your work for a while, but different pioneers out there who just independently are taking this on and really inventing new ways and new forms to reach women and to enable them to have much, much more dynamic impact for themselves and their families. And it brings me to, just as a sort of little closing set of comments, there happens to be I often take heart to some of stories coming out of children's books. I don't know if you had a child that you had to read children's books to. And there was a particular Dr. Seuss tale that really caught my attention and in some ways sort of captures the spirit of this effort to really think from moving from women in microfinance really up to women in the SME space. And the book is called Yertle the Turtle. And the story about Yertle the Turtle is he changes his perspective, and at each point he says that I am the king of all that I see. And I'm going to call this Yola the Queen, Yola the Turtle. And what Yola does is she starts out in a small pond, and she looks around and she says, I am the queen of all that I see. But of course, all she sees is what's in that little pond. And Yola encourages her fellow turtles to stack themselves up so that she starts out just in her little pond, and the next thing you know, she has 2 or 3 turtles that stack up, and she looks out and she can see a much broader area. She sees the pond and the immediate area around. And her fellow friend turtles keep stacking up, and at each point she gets on top, and she looks out, and in the end she sees a vast queendom, and really sees, factories and houses and cities. And in the end, she says, I am the queen of all that I see. And with that, I'm really trying to say that when we talk about women's leadership and when we talk about women's contribution, we don't want to limit ourselves just to what we can accomplish in the micro arena. We want to be the queen of all that we see. And we don't want to limit ourselves as women. We want to see women entrepreneurs at every level in our economy. Thank you. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Yes, please. I'm available for questions. Yeah. Yes.
Your turtle story was particularly appreciated since you're in an audience of terrapins here.
Yes.
I had a question related to, what I perceive as sort of the assistance that one receives as you move up the ladder, which was implicit in your turtle story. And is there evidence to suggest that women receive the same kind of mentoring from their own gender versus the other gender? And I think the evidence on that is a little bit mixed, and I'd be interested in hearing your words on it.
Yeah. Truthfully, the impression I have, and once again, I haven't done the careful review of the evidence, but the little information I have is that women receive far less counseling and support. And it gets back to, I think one of our fellow panelists earlier was commenting, what was she referring to, the multiplier effect, that if it's a smaller number of women, that you're going to get less of that kind of cohorts and support. And that's certainly true in many developing economies where there are very few women business leaders and where it's almost, that kind of stepping out feels very sort of challenging. But I do think that some of what you're starting to see emerge as I was mentioning that group in Pakistan, I was just really impressed that they were able to form sort of, support groups of different women and linking them with mentors. There are some other organizations that are specifically designed to link entrepreneurs with mentors. And I think we need to be able to link women to women and also women to men and vice versa. I mean, that it doesn't necessarily have to be gender specific, but we all do need those supports. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your enlightening remarks. Security, reconstruction and stabilization in emerging markets, and you obviously having such an important role in USAID would know much more than I can ever say anything about. Because USAID obviously is a huge component in all of these missions around the world. I want to say something about it and ask your opinion about this as they relate to the extra vulnerability of women in these conflict zones, conflict situations, not necessarily because of armed conflict, but also in transition economies, but also any kind of conflict that occurs because of crime networks, ethnic conflicts, full-blown wars. The reason why I want to bring this up is because without security and secure space, it's extremely difficult, as all would agree in here, to have any kind of economy to flourish. It's extremely, exponentially more difficult for women, especially in emerging markets, to shore themselves in such economies as we see in Iraq and Afghanistan right now, what they're trying to do, although I think U.S. is really trying its best to flourish their economies, especially in Iraq. I think there is a big success. But I'd like to have your input on this, because I think the one element that was missing from today's dialogue was security as it relates to women's economic development.
Yeah. Thank you. And in fact, just yesterday I had a briefing from Carla Coppell, who's one of the senior gender advisors at USAID, in part because she and Karen Groen, who was here earlier, also one of the senior advisors, have been involved with creating a whole action plan around gender-based violence and strategies for addressing issues of women's security so that they can, in fact, become economic actors. And you're absolutely correct that due to conflict situations, that women do become have been very, very vulnerable. And there is this sort of broader action plan. I wish I remember exactly the name of it, but if you were to Google, conflict, and there is this kind of action plan that's just been released. And they're really in the process of developing a series of work plans to test out what are the most effective strategies to address exactly this issue. Probably, once again, I would want to have confidence going to places that have worked their way through some of these issues to see what the answers might be. So I've been hearing some very inspiring stories coming out of Rwanda, out of the Congo, out of Eastern Europe, places that have undergone horrific violence and where women have, in fact, had very, very difficult circumstances. And it's interesting to me, I'm always looking at the ground to see how the real world can teach us. So I wish I had a better answer, but to simply let you know that that certainly is front and center on USAID's horizon, and then as we develop more from this kind of broader action plan to actually work plans to really start implementing, we'll be in a better position to answer that. Yes. Sure, please.
It seems to me one of the big problems going from micro to small, medium-level enterprises is the need to work with agencies of government, which often involve only men. So suddenly it's the tax collector, the inspector, all of those. And if there's, just from the little experience of India, if there isn't a good way to handle that part of the problem, there'll always be a significant challenge for women in the regulated sector.
A very, very good point, and that was one of the constraints that we did. You could sort of look out there and see it. The question's going to be how to handle it. It could well be that there might be women's business associations who collectively might hire their guy, that goes out and deals with those external parties on their behalf. Or it could well be that they'll use some sort of family networks to work around those issues. All I know is I have great confidence in the creativity and the tenacity of people to arrive at location-specific and culture-specific solutions that could work for them. It may be that some women will be using their oldest son to do that for them, if there really are those kind of barriers. That being said, over time, as more women are in the environment running businesses, women will start to get more comfortable in that role, and the tax collectors will start to become accustomed to women approaching them. So I think it can really, there's different, the world will unfold in different ways, and and I think we want to learn how it's being unfolded and help to share those experiences from one place to the next.
Yeah, one thing that I would suggest might work is more women tax collectors, right?
And more women tax collectors. Excellent. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to know, what's the U.S. doing to minimize the negative impact they have in developing countries' economies? I'm from El Salvador, and we're under CAFTA, the Central America Free Trade Agreement. And well, since this agreement came to our country, like our economy was like very affected, and well, many small businesses had to close and everything. So how can a woman feel empowered to start her own business in an economy where, you know, there are like many limited possibilities? And and well, you know, we've talked about gender barriers, but what about the barriers that have been kind of imposed by the U.S.? You know, like very limited possibilities for small businesses and small, limited possibilities for women to create their own businesses.
All right, I'm not exactly under your. Is it because of free trade? Is that it? The free trade, yeah, you think is lacking, diminishing, that you have these imports coming in, and that, yes, therefore is crowding out local business? Yes. Is that your point?
Yeah. So how is a woman going to feel that she can create her own business if there are no possibilities in the country for to do that?
Well, obviously, free trade is a big topic, and there will be some who will contend that that free trade, in fact, opens up opportunities for exports for those small businesses in those countries to be able to export to the United States. It may also lower the cost of certain, pieces of equipment that could actually help small enterprises. So I don't think that it's 100% clear which way free trade is going to impact upon the business climate. Maybe there's somebody else here who knows more, but my sense is there's plenty of studies that might show that free trade actually would stimulate the economic opportunities across the globe. So I wouldn't jump to any conclusion. That being said, it does take the ability to accumulate a certain amount of assets. That's why I'm very happy to see different kinds of banks getting more and more into the mix to finance local businesses. And I think that as women become better connected into those local business networks and are able to begin to grow their own enterprises, I still would think that there would be opportunity. But I wouldn't jump to any conclusion one way or the other about what the implications are of free trade. The Salvadorian people are very dynamic, and they're very entrepreneurial, so I have no doubt that there are many that are doing a good job. Yes.
I just wanted to add a little bit more to what you said because, more recently, I see a great deal of products coming from Guatemala in supermarkets, for example.
Right.
And I know that there are some entrepreneurs in Guatemala who are very, very happy that there is this free trade agreement because, they're selling their products here in the U.S. And, I can go through entire islands in the supermarket and find lots of Guatemalan products there. Now, it also, by contrast, I don't see any products from El Salvador, or I don't see any products from Nicaragua. So what I think is that maybe in some of those countries, the government has not done a good job of informing people of how they can use the free trade agreement to actually support businesses in their country.
Yeah. interesting. In the 80s, I was doing a lot of work in Central America, and I couldn't help but notice if I was in Costa Rica or in Guatemala, I found, canned products from El Salvador. So who knows? Maybe El Salvador is more of a regional player, and these Guatemaltecos have figured out how to get the products here. So I don't know if this might be beyond the purview of this meeting. I'm not certain whether it's women entrepreneurs or men, but lots of opportunity.
Hello, my name is Watson Bruce, and I'm originally from Liberia. And I have a financial management consulting firm. My question is, based on your research or findings, have you found out that capacity building and technical assistance is one of the major barriers? The reason I'm asking this, I've worked with a lot of women groups in Africa. And the problem they have accessing finance or credit is because they don't have that capacity infrastructure in place. With that, what is your office doing since you are encouraging microenterprise to SMEs to build capacity? Because I think that's one of the greatest barriers, being able to work with these microenterprises to take them to SMEs. So that's my question. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, excellent question. Actually, and it always cheers my heart to hear about Liberia because that was some of my very first work in Africa. Just recently, though, we're in the process of providing support to an organization called Peace Dividend Trust. And Peace Dividend Trust is specifically working, it's just starting out in Liberia. It's done a lot of work in Afghanistan in the past, but it's really focused now on Liberia. And what they do, quite interestingly, something a bit akin to what We Connect is doing, what they have been doing is inventorying local businesses. And we are specifically, as part of our arrangement with them, requiring them to reach out to include women-owned businesses as well as the more traditional men-owned businesses. But they're inventorying these businesses, and they're serving a bit of a matchmaker between the local business and development agencies. So that if there is a school that needs to be built, or if there's a cafeteria that needs to have food to supply it, or recognizing that development agencies come into a country that's had a lot of unrest and they invest substantial resources, we'd like to see as much of those resources go to stay locally and work with local entrepreneurs. So they're doing that kind of matchmaking with the development agencies and the local businesses on the one hand, and they're also trying to work with the commercial banking sector to have the banks provide loans that would be so that if a local business shows up with a contract to build a school, that they'll be able to, let's say, borrow 50% of the value of that contract so they can begin to source the local materials. Once again, we're just getting started in Liberia. They've done a fabulous job in Afghanistan. And I think and part of it is not just a matter of identifying and listing them on the in this directory, but really providing that sort of hand-holding and business counseling that we refer to as technical assistance and capacity building. Yeah. But you might also, as a woman entrepreneur yourself, you very well might have a lot of very valuable skills that are needed by different micro-entrepreneurs and certainly associations of different shapes and sizes. Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much, everyone.